Thank you for joining this panel. It does cable shocks, subsea, relating to incidents of outages, but then also what we can do moving forward to protect ourselves a little more while at the same time improving economic activity on the back of this system. So I think just to get started right away, because we're pressed for time, I should ask the panelists, starting from Tunde, to just introduce themselves briefly, and then we can get cracking.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ayotunde Koka, shortened to Tunde Koka. I'm the chairman of the Africa Data Center Association and also the chief executive officer in Africa for open access data centers. Just briefly, open access data center, which also has WIOC that provides hyperscale, wholesale, open access connectivity. So we bring what is a carrier-neutral data center, open access, with wholesale open access connectivity. And we have what we call converged open digital infrastructure across Africa. It's a unique offering, and we build core data centers and edge data centers, but the core ones are in South Africa, one's gone live here in DRC, and a large one where the Aquino cable lands in Lagos. I say that for context of the connectivity part of chipping into this discussion that we have here, hence the wire connectivity piece. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Theophilus Benson, a professor from Carnegie Mellon University, currently working in Kigali. Unlike the other panelists, I come from an academic background. A lot of what I've been looking at is more trying to understand from a modeling statistical perspective, what is the implications of these cable cuts on connectivity and how do we start to reason about alternatives to addressing these cuts?
Bonjour à tous. Moi, c'est Gaëtan Soltesz. Je représente le Congo-Brazzaville avec l'opérateur d'infrastructure Silicone Connect. Et donc, nous avons un modèle wholesale où nous nous adressons principalement aux opérateurs fixes et mobiles du pays pour le transport des grandes capacités en transit à travers le Congo. Voilà, je serai également votre correspondant francophone pour ce panel, même si je comprends très bien l'anglais également. Mais voilà, pour des questions de bilinguisme, moi, je vais m'adresser à vous en français.
Bonjour, my name is Nomsa. And I am part of Meta. I work for the network investments team, and our team works on network infrastructure investments. I represent a team that works in Middle East and Africa. And I also work with ICANN. I'm a TCR. I also work with ISOC chapter in Zimbabwe. I do quite a lot of things in the community. And I also work with AFPIF, which I'll talk about. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So as some of you might be aware, we've had some challenges across the Red Sea in the last year that has resulted in either outages or inability to grow more cables through the region. My question to the panelists is, what do we think on the back of these ongoing Red Sea issues is the long-term plan for Africa, particularly as it relates to deploying new subsea capacity? Nomsa, would you like to go first?
Sure. So maybe just a brief background. I'm not sure if all of you are aware of the issues in the Red Sea. So early this year, around February, we had a triple outage. So we lost 3 major cables. This is at the back of a lot of other problems with congestion in that area. And as a result, there was a lot of traffic that was disturbed, especially coming from the east. And so when you're looking at problems like that, you have to look at them holistically, because you're looking at what has led this progression of congestion up to that point. And then looking at it, you start to look at other avenues. And in our case, and I'm now speaking on behalf of our team in Meta, we had to look for other cables and try to figure out if there's a way to do this, to carry traffic, especially from the East Coast, through other cables. And the challenge then becomes, what is the other alternative? It's almost sudden when you have to look at these things So looking at the long term is like, are we building more cables? Are we going to start developing more cables going through Asia, or are we going to do this terrestrially? So I think it's more of a holistic approach. We're looking into it because you can't look at just that small problem. There's also the development of the ecosystem around, because you can't also look at sea in isolation.
Anyone else on the panel like to add?
Yeah, the Red Sea itself just demonstrated the impact other activities could have on subsea connectivity, which actually is the heartbeat of the entire global internet infrastructure that actually is now global critical in many ways. And with these cable costs, there have been discussions around, well, how do you build resilience? To an extent, there's an element of resilience, else we'll just have had a total breakdown. I think we had 3 cables of 15 go down. We saw that I think when that happened, there was about 2 terabits restoration onto other cable systems, SIMI 5, so on. So there's an element of resilience there. However, what happened is available capacity got choked out, but it's starting to get quite used up anyway. And it's starting to drive the right discussions as what level of resilience do we have in subsea cable systems? What are the likelihoods of other events based on things just like Yemeni war? I think there's a cargo ship that was hit by some missile or whatever. I don't know if it was intentional and so on. And the crew did what they needed to do. And for the right reason, they dropped anchor. Coincidentally, they just, from what I sort of understand, there's just happened to be some bad weather, sea currents, and the anchor started to drag, which is the most likely cause of sea cable breakage anyway. And they just took out these other three cables. Well, does it mean that in a critical environment like that, we have to have situations of heightened awareness, in which case that ship, there has to have been proactive intervention on that ship to make sure that what happened does not happen? And I think those are the kind of questions that we need to ask. And it becomes a global question because the Red Sea is around the Yemeni area. And also to the west of that is Eritrea. 2 areas where it's very difficult even to get the permits are required to instigate the repair. So we had a situation where the Red Sea had the issue from March. Actually, it was just last month that got fixed, early July. And that's a long time to have cable issues. And very broad issues. One, getting the permits from the Yemenis. I think there were some assumptions that, oh my God, so how are we going to do this? But they ended up actually being reasonably cooperative. Would you get the insurance for the ships that need to go and get it fixed? That itself was a question. That took a lot of discussion. So we suddenly have this new topic because it's been quite unprecedented what's happened. That happened this year. We'll probably talk about that as well. Just off the coast of Congo last year, we had a landslide that caused a break. And then you got what happened in West Africa. Then suddenly gets followed by what happened on the East Coast with another cable system. And we've never seen this happen one after the other ever. I can't, from what I hear, we can't recall this happening. So it begs the question, how do we broadly make sure that there's resilience and global affirmative action and frameworks to make sure we avoid these kind of cable cuts? They'll happen, but how can we do something to make sure we avoid them happening? Or we have frameworks that means that the response to restoration and fixing the issue happens very quickly. And I think those are broader discussions around regional bodies, United Nations, or whatever else it takes, and the global subsea cable communities that come together now and then across the world.
Thanks, Tunde. So obviously there's quite a bit of work there that we still need to understand and we still need to get done. And I think it would be nice to generate some thoughts from the floor about any questions around this topic. But while you're doing that, I'll ask Theo, specifically for someone who lives in a very landlocked country with dependence on coastal countries, that land cable is a massive vulnerability. What can landlocked countries specifically do to protect themselves or mitigate these kinds of issues where coastal countries are no longer accessible for subsea? What do you think are the options there?
So I think it's quite challenging. One of the things we actually experience is we frequently get emails, perhaps every other month, saying there's going to be connectivity issues because of one of the neighboring countries that we rely on in Rwanda. And trying to get around that is quite difficult. One of the things we've been looking at is LEO satellites, so using Starlink as a way to augment existing connectivity. But that doesn't provide the same level of bandwidth or latency as actually going subsea. So I think for us, the question is, how do we find alternatives? Because we need to actually get connected either by forming new alliances with partners to the West, trying to go up into some of the things that we've been looking at.
So are you saying satellite is likely making a comeback? It's okay. You can say yes. It's fine.
I think it's challenging to say yes. In Rwanda, I think we have about 100 and something devices. Some of them are for just connecting rural schools and rural, I'm not sure what other kind of institutions, but they're basically trying to get connectivity out to the edge. But that's just less than 200. I wouldn't call that a comeback.
Gaëtan?
La question était comment font les pays qui n'ont donc pas accès à des câbles sous-marins sur leurs côtes, étant que ce ne sont pas des pays non côtiers, mais des pays qui sont à l'intérieur des terres. Je vais prendre un exemple qui est tout proche de nous ici. Il s'agit de la République centrafricaine. Donc la Centrafrique, c'est un pays qui est voisin de la RDC, qui est voisin du Congo-Brazzaville. C'est un pays qui est voisin du Cameroun. En fin de compte, ces pays n'ont guère d'autre choix que de s'adresser aux opérateurs frontaliers avec qui ils sont connectés. Donc le Central African Backbone Project, le projet CAB, a construit sur fonds publics une infrastructure à fibre optique nationale. Et cette infrastructure à fibre optique nationale aujourd'hui arrive à notre frontière au Congo-Brazzaville, arrive également au Cameroun. Et donc aujourd'hui, les Centrafricains ont l'option de sortir le trafic Internet par Ouesso au Congo, et ensuite depuis Ouesso, nous on les transporte jusqu'au câble sous-marin, par exemple, WAX aujourd'hui, Tout Africa un petit peu plus tard. Et à travers le Cameroun, ils ont également accès à d'autres câbles sous-marins. Par contre, se pose la question, bien entendu, de la résilience de cet accès. Parce que ça veut dire qu'il y a maintenant plusieurs facteurs. Il n'y a pas seulement la résilience du câble en lui-même qui est un facteur à prendre en considération. Le câble WAX au Congo a connu de nombreux incidents au cours de ces dernières années, que ce soit sur les circuits nord ou sud. Donc, il faut que le pays lui-même se dise, mais tiens, si on est à Bangui, par où est-ce qu'on peut sortir? Est-ce qu'on est obligé de sortir par le Congo ou par le Cameroun? Est-ce qu'on peut pas aller ailleurs? Et donc, en fait, ici, le sujet, c'est l'intégration sous-régionale. Il faut prendre une vue un petit peu plus haute. Il faut considérer le pays avec tous les pays voisins, tous les câbles qui existent aujourd'hui et futurs, et se rallier à ces projets de construction. Par exemple, Silicone va, à partir de l'année prochaine, entamer un vaste projet de fibrer la Likwala jusqu'à Bétou. Bétou est à 200 km de Bangui. Ça intéresse fortement la Centrafrique. Ils nous disent, mais monsieur Soltesz, venez construire les 200 km restants. Comme ça, Bangui n'aura pas un seul câble, mais deux, avec en plus des chemins physiquement séparés. Et c'est comme ça, en fait, qu'on construit l'intégration sous-régionale. C'est que on fait ce maillage terrestre pour vraiment se connecter à un maximum de réseaux et de pays. Et ensuite, ça permet donc aux opérateurs de pouvoir passer des accords avec donc les opérateurs qui ont une diversité de câbles sous.
Tunde, real quick.
I was just going to give one sort of analogy on the landlocked countries. It's an issue. And they say the new superhighway is digital. Okay. So whether it's digital reach into landlocked countries with fiber and so on, it's an issue whether it's railway transportation, whether it's road networks and so on, and it needs regional and country collaboration to give access in some way. Having said that, one other emergence now is of the low-level flying satellites, whatever they're called, right? Low-orbit satellites. bring in, reduce latency and so on. But there's a reality of it that still does not deliver the intense capacity you require. However, on a country basis, it's starting to transform, okay, in terms of access to the internet. So there's a lifeline which is unique to digital, that there's some sort of satellite reach that can provide a level of a relief, for want of a better term, for landlocked countries when there are issues with access to cable, fiber, broadband cable connectivity to the subsea cables, right? But I don't think low orbit satellites are a solution to the broader subsea issue, because they just don't the yet.
So maybe Nomsa, on the back of what the three gentlemen have said, Gaëtan specifically has indicated some projects that are happening in the region to interconnect the landlocked countries as best they can. And obviously, as we all know, African countries are in many ways politically, economically, socially different, which does make it quite interesting to bring a cohesive solution together. Is the plan potentially having individual operations in different countries doing their own thing and then collaborating at the border? Is it one big operator doing something across the whole of Africa to some degree per region? Is it a combination? In other words, what I'm saying is it's not an easy problem to fix, but it needs to be fixed. So what's the best approach, you think?
Yesterday, there was a speaker that spoke of trying to develop cross-country infrastructure. And you find that you get to the border on one side, you get to the border on the other side, but you can't cross. It's all of these things you need to consider, and how regulation and how policies are built around building infrastructure that spans beyond countries. And I think in a community that comes up in a stronger way, and I know there's several communities that are already in existence. Whilst we talk about subsea, there is regional groups that look into specifics. But again, this is also sectionalized. It's still at a sub-regional level, and we need to come together more and more, start talking about all the regional problems holistically. So there are people that are going to be focused on the technical aspects, the education piece, the development of policies, all of that coming together. And this is where we were talking about when I was mentioning the establishment of AfPIF. It's organizations like this that might just help. It had to start from somewhere, because at the end of the day, you look at operators in the region, there is a lot of competitiveness and it's healthy. But at some point, people need to take off their hats, sit in one room and start strategizing on issues that affect us. And as a region, if you look at our participation, since we're talking about subsea, it's for the most part 1 to 2%. So there is very little participation on the global market for us to actually put forward some of the issues that we're facing and get that closer collaboration. So it's more of a holistic approach again. And if we're starting from a country, for as long as there is somewhere where people can come together and keep talking about the things that are imminent and strategizing on the way forward, I think that will work better. So just going back to AfPIF, AfPIF is the Africa Subsea Ecosystem Forum. It was founded by people within the community, and it's a new organization that is meant to start giving a platform to people on the continent on issues that need to be addressed, opportunities that are there. We get situations where we are in a global environment, of course. There is expertise that comes from everywhere, but I think there's also a chance for Africa to start going a little deeper in what we can do to grow expertise on the continent. And it's already there, by the way. This is why we have all of these cables. There's more coming. There is absolutely more coming. And there's got to be a community that rallies around, both from a country's perspective and a regional perspective.
So what Nomsa is being terribly modest about is that she's one of the founding members of AfPIF. And I think it's a great initiative, because what she's trying to do with AfPIF, with her co-founders, is to demystify subsea and what that means, but most importantly, to improve participation of Africans in the subsea space as creators, as investors, as technologists, so that we are not only consuming, but we're actually part of that ecosystem. So that's fantastic. But then you do say, and maybe I'll ask Gaëtan to handle this one, we have been, for the last decade, was as far as I can remember with AfPIF, and maybe a couple of notes, we've been talking about we need to get countries involved, governments involved, regulators involved in solving these challenges. And it's been about 15 years of the same story. And we're still talking about the same thing 15 years later. I reckon in 2034, it might be the same thing unless we do something different now. So, Gaëtan, in your experience, what is the actual problem that is preventing that governmental organization that is required to get this thing over the line?
I can see two different angles to this answer. Pardon, excusez-moi, je vais m'exprimer en français. Donc, il y a deux différentes manières de répondre à ça. Il y a d'abord l'aspect de l'opérateur, et puis il y a l'aspect du gouvernement et donc de son ministère des télécommunications, ainsi que de son régulateur. Les opérateurs sont avant tout pragmatiques. Nous, ce qu'on cherche, c'est à construire de l'infrastructure avec, on va dire, le meilleur rapport qualité-prix, c'est-à-dire qu'on cherche à mettre la fibre optique dans le sol, sur les lignes OPGW le moins cher possible, et à un niveau de qualité qui est le standard international en vigueur. Le gouvernement, lui, a bien sûr une ambition et des objectifs nationaux. Chaque gouvernement étant souverain. Donc, vous avez une régulation, vous avez une loi des télécoms qui est souveraine à chaque pays. Et ici, nous sommes en RDC. Il y a le régulateur qui est ici, la RPTC, qui est d'ailleurs sponsor de cet événement. Chez nous, le régulateur s'appelle la RPCE au Congo-Brazzaville, et puis il s'appelle l'ARCEP en France, et puis il porte un nom différent dans tous les pays. Mais in fine, c'est la même organisation. Ce régulateur est souverain dans la manière dont il articule la loi et notamment la taxation sectorielle. Et c'est sur la taxation sectorielle que je pense que les différences sont les plus importantes. Je vais vous prendre un exemple. Je parlais récemment avec mes homologues gabonais à Libreville, qui m'expliquent que là-bas, l'opérateur d'infrastructure nationale est taxé 3,5% de son chiffre d'affaires, avec une contribution de 2% au fonds d'accès aux services universels. Donc au total, l'opérateur d'infrastructure est taxé 5,5% de son chiffre d'affaires en taxes sectorielles. OK ? Donc, il paye 5,5% de son CA, et puis ensuite, il a ses propres charges, ses frais de fonctionnement, ses coûts directs et indirects. Ici, au Congo-Brazzaville, donc de l'autre côté du fleuve, les choses sont très différentes. Les lois de finances, depuis la 2009, création de l'agence de régulation jusqu'à l'actuelle loi de finances, sont les véhicules par lesquels la régulation met à jour les barèmes et les changements de loi, donc pour la loi sectorielle. Et ces barèmes sont entre 10 et 20 fois plus élevés, malheureusement, que la plupart des pays qui nous entourent. En 2022, je devais payer théoriquement 180% de mon chiffre d'affaires taxe sectorielle. Je peux évidemment pas payer 180% de mon chiffre d'affaires. Mathématiquement, c'est impossible. Le barème a évidemment un petit peu baissé. En 2022, la taxe backbone est passée à 2 millions par 100 km par gigabit, ce qui représente $5 sur votre mégabit transporté entre... alors, $5, ça reste quand même très... Parce qu'évidemment, quand ma capacité de $1 le mégabit, genre 5, on arrive à Brazza, on est déjà à plus de 10 ou voire autour de $15 une fois qu'on a rajouté notre petite marge cost plus. Et donc, forcément, le prix de vente ici à Brazzaville est extrêmement le pays, et plus la distance est longue, et plus cette taxe, quelque part, est importante. Un opérateur qui est ici me demandait, Silicone, est-ce que vous êtes capable de transporter 1 terabit, 2 terabits jusqu'à Kinshasa? Je leur ai dit aucun problème. D'un point de vue technique, nous, on est prêts. On a l'infrastructure pour le faire. Mais sachez que ça va vous coûter entre 10 et 20 milliards de francs CFA par an en taxes. Ils m'ont regardé en rigolant et puis ils m'ont expliqué, vous savez, c'est par le Congo. On va passer plutôt soit par la RDC, soit par le Cameroun. Et on va contourner le Congo-Brazzaville. Et donc, le Congo-Brazzaville, avec sa régulation qui est extrêmement chère, en réalité, se prive d'un marché, étant donné que pour les opérateurs, c'est le pragmatisme qui prime. C'est combien ça coûte. Est-ce qu'on peut avoir la même qualité ailleurs? Et au final, si ça coûte moins cher de passer par un autre réseau, c'est ce qu'ils font. Et donc, voilà. Et donc, ce sont des revenus qui échappent au Congo ou au pays où le coût de la régulation est trop cher. Donc, j'adresse ce message régulièrement à notre ministère de tutelle et à notre régulation au Congo en leur disant, c'est pas au niveau de la production qu'il faut taxer, c'est au niveau de la consommation. Donc, il faut pas taxer l'opérateur d'infrastructure et lui frapper dessus comme si c'était un cheval mort. Ça ne sert à rien parce que vous allez le tuer, il va mourir, vous allez l'étouffer. Et comme il pourra de toute façon pas en plus payer son impôt, qu'est-ce qu'il va faire? Il va venir se mettre à genoux devant vous chaque année avec ses factures en disant comment on fait. Et puis au final, ben, nous, on paye à la tête du client. C'est justice quand on y pense. Donc c'est anormal que ça se passe comme ça. Dans l'état de droit, qui est une notion donc juridique, eh bien, dans l'état de droit, on devrait appliquer la loi. Malheureusement, la loi devrait être la même pour tout le monde. Mais si vous ne pouvez pas appliquer la loi parce que la régulation est tellement chère qu'on ne peut pas la payer, ben, comment ça marche? Ben, ça marche à la bonne entente. Malheureusement, dans nos pays ici, on sait comment la bonne entente fonctionne et elle fonctionne pas très bien. Donc, c'est fondamentalement d'abord ce modèle qu'il faut revoir. Deuxièmement, c'est le niveau de taxation qu'il faut baisser. Moi, je demande 3%. Je serais très content de pouvoir payer 3% de mon chiffre d'affaires pour l'ensemble de mes taxes réglementaires. Et ça me permettrait de travailler normalement et de continuer de construire l'infrastructure que l'on est en train de mettre en place avec le Gabon, avec la Centrafrique, avec le Cameroun, avec la RDC, avec le Cabinda cette année. Merci.
Thanks, Gaëtan. So as Tunde just prepares to give his input, I think since I'll pose a question to Kyle, since he's the one that's representing AFIX, to think about how to respond to the challenge Gaëtan has put up with regard specifically to interactions we've had with AU and all sorts of other organizations between ISOC and so forth over the decade on how we can make governments come together. So while you think about that answer, I'll have
Yeah, I
Tunde.
was just going to build on. Laurent did a very good job yesterday. He walked across here and looked the minister in the eye. And I'll paraphrase that just in general conversation. You see the goose that is likely to lay the golden egg. So you think you're going to start to try and choke it, and you don't get the golden egg. If you're lucky, you might get some egg that cracks when it lands, but the golden egg's gone. And that's what you find in many. In fact, I would even say, don't talk about 3%. That's very generous. We've got to change the narrative and educate to say, you've actually got to have affirmative investment encouragement in digital infrastructure. We quote this a lot, and it's played out. The thing is that 10% broadband penetration can give you an uplift in GDP, right? Digital infrastructure is what's going to enable Africa to transform, whether it's going to be around education, if it's going to be around health, it's going to be around prosperity, lives and livelihoods. That's going to be enabled through digital infrastructure. I say to governors or whoever else where we are, oh, this right-of-way stuff and so on is very short-term revenue generation. You don't get the investment. If anything, you've got to turn it around to say, okay, I'm going to encourage investment here and tax breaks or whatever else it is to bring the digital infrastructure into play to grow the economies. You see, 2% in Africa is 2.5% GDP uplift. That 1.5% is average, taking the fact that in the US it's probably 0.5%. The research shows in other places but it'd be 1%, but in Africa it's more like 2% GDP uplift now. Well, you need the broadband adoption to really achieve that. Penetration is the first thing, adoption is the next thing. Adoption means, therefore, that you build a whole new industry around smarter devices that you have to enable to put in the hands of people that will create absolutely whole new industries. And African agriculture will not succeed if you do not have it digitized. It's been shown to be the case because you do all of the leaky bits where resources leak out and stuff like that. They're closed out by digital infrastructure. Then that enables the build of data centers. We've just invested millions of dollars in infrastructure here in Kinshasa. It's going to be a game changer. New ecosystems, new vibrant peering activities are going to go on. And now you have an ability to drive and host systems like you never could do before, right? And there are two players right now, and it's really going to be a systemic game changer. Now, research has also shown that if you build a megawatt, typically it's in some places $8 million, in others $15 million per megawatt to build. Okay, around here it's more like say 15, right? The direct or induced impact of that investment is actually 10, 50, 100 times. Okay, why? We just spent lots of money hiring construction workers, building what we've built. Although the M&E investments came in here somewhere through some routes. People we've employed, a whole range of the ecosystem that builds the data center. The induced impact could be 50 times that investment. When you then start to operate, you've got local economies that you employ for cleaning, for maintenance of your generators and other services. You bring new skill sets into the economy that was never there before. I won't be specific, but there are certain things that we think, well, you mean you really don't have this here? No, there isn't one in the whole of DR Congo. So we have to bring it in. But you know what's happened? We've brought in new competencies and new capabilities into the economy over here. So if you then spend your $10 million on the megawatt, that means direct or induced impact, okay, could be not 100 million. It's actually $500 million to $1 billion of what you'll realize. That's the reality we have to make sure that African governments understand. So forget the 3%. Flip it around the other way. And we need to educate the fin funds here. We need to the investors, the World Banks or the IMFs of this world and Propagos and so on. When you look at these investments, there has to be direct engagement to say, look, systemically, guys, you've got to rethink the way you go about all of these tax issues and flip the coin. It's affirmative support for bringing digital infrastructure. And we should do it with an attitude.
So, sorry, you need a mic. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm sure putting on this show, you're coming across a lot of government types in many countries as you look for an event location. So you're talking to them. Just off the top of your head, no commitments, I understand. Do you see any potential use case with AFIX or AfPIF or the combination?
Yeah, of course. A big part of this is aligning interests. I think from my point of view, we've got a lot of different organizations working around the region towards developing the internet ecosystem, and making sure that we're all working towards the same objectives is key. Collaborating across these organizations, whether it's the Internet Society, the World Bank, or through the IXF and other regional IXP associations around the world. And even local market players like in Uganda, we got to make sure that we're not working against each other when we lobby the government for different policies and stuff. So it's important that we're all aligned. And I think events like AfPIF help bring that together. When we go into a country, we often partner with local governments, right? And that helps generate buy-in from their perspective. You saw yesterday, there was a massive, relatively large government delegation that came here and sat through Patrick Christian's talk from Telegeography. And that contextual awareness is really important that raises, because a lot of countries are still considering their policy as if they're an island, but really having a better understanding of what's going on around them and how they fit into the bigger picture. And maybe they're falling behind or maybe they're ahead and what they might need to change, I think helps a lot. And so as AfPIF, we're working to attract and incorporate more policy and regulatory related content and attendees. We're just having a meeting related to that before this session about how we can do that more going forward to help reduce that friction and create a more enabling environment. So.
All right. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Matthew, you have something to say real quick?
Yeah, actually, I have kind of a common question. So most of AfPIF has always mostly been engineers. The question is mostly on the landlocked part. So I fully agree with what Gaëtan said. We have all this taxation and regulation problem, and that goes at the political level, which is something harder to deal with. But we operate in DRC. We are operating in Goma, like many of my friends and competitors in DRC who operate in Goma. And Goma is not a one-step landlocked place. It's a two-step landlocked place, at least. If you want to go from Goma to the sea, you have to go through 2 different countries at least. So most of us today, we go through Rwanda and then to Uganda and then to Kenya, like South Sudan. They all go to Kenya. Like most of Uganda network or Rwanda network, they all go through Kenya. So we go to that bottleneck all the way to Mombasa. And when something happens in Kenya, technical or not, we all suffer from that in our operation. There's another road, which is straight to Dar es Salaam, except none of us take this road because that road is way too expensive. And as Gaëtan mentioned, at the end of the day, we are operators. We are here to make money and go to the most cost-efficient direction. Connectivity exists between Kigali and Dar, and we can all get all the submarine cable in Dar es Salaam. But because one of us is trying to make crazy money out of us, then they make zero money at the end of the day, because all of us go the same way. And that's not politics. It's not regulation. It's not taxation. It's one of us trying to take that money. And I'm not going to blame that operator here because this is just one example because we are in DRC. I have tons of examples like that across the continent. We can talk about Chad. We can talk about Niger. We can talk about Burkina Faso, Mali, and I can take a long list. How do we make a bit of sense telling them, I'm from your neighboring countries. I'm not going to come to your country and steal your business. I'm just going through, trying to get to the sea. Some countries have understood that. Kenya has understood that. They make a lot of money with their operators and their operators pay taxes. So like the 3.5% Gaëtan mentioned. So they could give that 3.5% out of their revenue to the government. They would make money, but they need to start their business. Today, they have zero business. How do we convince those operators to actually do it? So us landlocked operators get diversity and more alliance in our network.
Theo, you want to say something to that real quick? How do we convince the governments in those countries to allow transit while Darwin gets ready?
So I think it was more a question of how do we change the economics and convince the other operators to be more favorable, not the government themselves. And I feel like that's part of this bigger issue of how do you get more cooperation. I don't think it's an easy answer. I think if the CEO of your company is offshore in Dubai or somewhere, all he sees are immediate gains. And so we need to have higher ups be more aware of the long-term. As Tunde said, there is a long-term benefit, but you need to actually have some short-term costs. And I think, I don't know how to do that. I feel like as an academic, I am the least, maybe Tunde can.
Well, Kyle is going to fix it. So. I think I'm just kidding.
But I think it's changing that understanding from the higher ups in terms of the economics.
Just
Policymakers is the answer. Ce sont en réalité les gouvernements. Ce sont les gouvernements et leurs ministres des télécommunications qui sont la clé, selon moi, pour cette intégration sous-régionale. Ce sont eux qui ont le pouvoir de changer positivement l'environnement sectoriel dans lequel nous évoluons ici, l'environnement des télécommunications. Ce sont les ministres des télécommunications, donc il était là hier, monsieur le ministre de la RDC. Je connais très bien et je fréquente beaucoup notre ministre au Congo également. Ce sont en réalité qui sont les hommes à convaincre que non, il ne faut pas trop taxer le secteur. Oui, il faut l'encourager à travers des mesures favorables, à travers même des subventions, par exemple, pour construire des infrastructures, à travers des prix régulés dans lesquels les opérateurs s'y retrouvent sans qu'il y ait d'abus comme ceux que Mathieu a cités, par exemple. Donc voilà, pour moi, c'est vraiment là. Et c'est dans cette relation entre les techniciens que nous sommes tous ici et les policymakers qui sont au niveau des gouvernements. C'est dans cette interaction-là que, fondamentalement, la solution, à mon avis, se trouve.
Darwin?
Yeah, sure. So, Darwin Costa from DKIX. Just out of curiosity, so the West has been suffering lately a lot with cable cuts. Lately, there were 3 cables down at the same time, and all of a sudden, Ikiano was the rescue. So, with Meta coming up with this huge project for Africa, I'm just wondering, and the only thing I can assume is that Google did a different desktop survey when they were laying the cable. Is Meta looking into that as well?
Yes. So when To Africa was surveyed, the whole idea is also to bring in redundancy and to separate the cables. So if you know what happened in West Africa on the coast, Ivory Coast, there was a landslide. And so we lost 4 cables, SAT3, WAX, ACE, and main one. So these are natural disasters. They occur And even when you look at how it affects operators that are relying on that capacity, there is such a disaster. The ripple effect goes to as far as the user, and you can't really recoup anything out of it. It's force majeure if you then talking about adhering to SLAs or whatever. So when new cables are surveyed, there is also a need for this to be thought through. You have to really get to a point where you recognize that whatever you're implementing, new cable is coming in, you have to separate it from other cables. So that is why Equiano, even though it was also running along, it was further out. To Africa is even further out. So that's the protection that comes into play. With new cables, they will also come up with strategies starting from just the survey to eradicate that. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Because obviously the further cables are built away from the ocean, the more expensive it becomes. Obina.
Thank you, panelists. I just wanted to, it's been mentioned a little bit by Madam. So I just want to bring it out a little bit further. I think that if we should drive terrestrial connectivity from a community perspective, I think we could do better. Look at what happens in the data center space and the IX space. If you want to build a data center, the first thing that comes to your mind is, am I going to be carrier neutral? How will I be perceived? Will the interconnect community think I'm competing with them? Will the community I build my data center see me as being open to connectivity and all the stuff that come with carrier neutral data center? You do the same thing with an internet exchange point. You want to build internet exchange point. You want to look at how do I carry the community along? How do I get as many service providers into the environment and so on and so forth? Now, the closest people to their government, to the people that make things happen in that country are the locals there. When we came in here, we saw the impact of the local host here in this community. They are the first people that walk up to the minister and say, hey, look, you have to be here. You have to listen. I don't see Sally, CEO of Internet Society, coming from United States to come and drag the minister out. It's not possible. So if we can create a mindset where we can create some neutrality in this cable system, it's just a functional mindset. So if a businessman, or most likely, because look at the owners of this, the operators of the infrastructure, most times they are not even from that same country, but they want to invest in the country. I say, look, this is my community. I am coming into your own community. This is what I want to invest, but you guys are the locals. Can we do this together? Then the locals should drive those enforcement, should drive those conversations, should drive it on the condition that, look, these things will help us grow. This will help us do more. And once that is done, this idea of people running around for content, for this in our IXs and all that is solved by default, because I come from Nigeria. Nigeria could quickly actually send Connect Meta and all these guys who already have POPs in Lagos could easily, without any additional investment, put in content into Benin Republic, which is just the country next door to Nigeria, because the community then needs it. They drove for it, they work for it, and they convince their people to actually get that done. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So this is where we all realize we don't live in a bubble. We thought all the redundancy that's in the sea will help us go past problems. And then we found at one point we had 7 cables which were out. And at that point, this is when you start to think, what is the sign? What is it of not a presence on the coast? What is it that, how do we come together as a community? And it just has to start from somewhere, because when you have one unified voice, then it makes sense. And the community is the one that drives what they want to see. It's us that are experiencing these things, us that are on the continent, whose networks. If you look at what happened during the Red Sea crisis, you came up with any solution. It meant everyone is going to the same operators, prices shot up. It goes back to the basics. Are we looking at the fundamental needs? Are we looking at affordability? Because when we talk about the taxes, every additional dollar has an impact on the end user. And at the same time, we're saying we want to build this. We want to build a continent. We want all these corridors, east, west. north, south. We want a healthy ecosystem in the sea and on land. It takes a community and it's driven by the community. And that's where we can start from. It's the more we work in a disjointed manner, the more we will never get to a unified approach to addressing all of our challenges because they're huge. And if you look at, looking at cables like to Africa, it's consortium. It's not just one company. It's a group of companies that came together because you can't even build one cable by yourself. No matter how powerful, how much money you have, it's never infinite. So at the end of the day, it's again coming together and understanding the ecosystem, the needs of the users. At the end of the day, that's what we are all driving at. And then developing a unified approach to all of our challenges.
Okay. I'll take the last point from the floor and then one last question for the panel before we wrap up.
Parfait, Guamo. J'aimerais revenir sur les aspects abordés par Monsieur Gaëtan liés à la taxation et les coûts sont sur les panels, sur comment est-ce que les régulateurs ou ceux qui mettent en place les politiques publiques travaillent avec les opérateurs dans la mise en œuvre de ces politiques. Premier aspect. Et secondo, par exemple, sur la mise en place des lois de finances. Parce que on remarque une forme de récurrence dans la mise en place des lois de finances. Chaque année, chaque 2 ans, on est en face des nouvelles lois de finances, mais ces lois, c'est des messieurs qui sont dans leur environnement, dans leur bureau, qui décident, sans l'implication des différents acteurs, que ce soit les opérateurs ou les consommateurs. À la fin, on a juste une loi qui est pendue et tout le monde paye le prix de la loi. Est-ce qu'il existe des retours d'expérience des pays qui ont plus ou moins réussi à harmoniser ces politiques? C'est ce que j'aimerais entendre de vous. Merci. Merci.
So maybe Gaëtan, just maybe 1 quick minute on that so we can wrap up with the last question.
Merci beaucoup, Serge Parfait. Il est vrai qu'en réalité, la réponse, elle est politique. C'est-à-dire que j'en reviens à ce que je disais tout à l'heure, c'est au niveau du ministère des Télécommunications que cette volonté de changement doit venir. Le régulateur, je vais prendre l'exemple de celui du Congo que je connais, agit plus ou moins en indépendance. Et c'est vrai que chaque année, les projets de loi de finances sont envoyés aux opérateurs pour revue avant que la loi ne soit entérinée. Mais en réalité, comment ça se passe? Les revues sont envoyées 15 jours avant. Les opérateurs font des remarques un petit peu à la va-vite, mais n'ont pas réellement un mot à dire, étant donné que de toute façon, la régulation est souveraine et fait quand même ce qu'elle veut à la fin. Et que, voilà, nous, si on devait proposer une loi, on partirait plutôt d'une case blanche, on mettrait une flat tax et en gros, ce serait à peu près tout. Il n'y a peut-être pas besoin de plus que ça. Je vais peut-être passer le micro à mes collègues ici pour des exemples où d'autres pays ont eu une transformation réussie de cet environnement.
Thank you. So I think just to wrap up, because we're pressed for time, the final question, which I think I'll also ask us to intertwine with our parting message, is obviously we've been speaking a lot about terrestrial, so it's obvious terrestrial seems to be the best viable alternative to subsea outages, but we also still do need subsea. The last question I have for the panel, and I'll start from Tunde coming around here before we finish up, is Africa doing enough as Africa itself to invest in, build, operate, and develop subsea infrastructure on its own, considering that the bulk of, like Nomsa was saying, subsea investments are either driven by or accelerated by content providers today and or maybe China, let's say, less so telcos on their own. Do we have enough momentum as Africa to develop that strategy for ourselves without waiting for that help?
Yeah, you see, the subsea cables have come in with consortia, right? It's to Africa, Meta, and Google, Aquano, and it takes a lot of time. And in those consortiums, right, you have African companies, you have international companies. So I believe that's what's going to be happening going forward. However, that won't happen if we don't have the right contextual environment from a regulatory or market point of view. Also, if the subsea cables are there and they've not been eaten up by the sharks, the capacity has to be taken out there through terrestrial. Okay. And there's a lot that has been happening with building our terrestrial over time. And even that has to be encouraged. If you look at the maps of penetration of subsea, Africa used to be so incredibly dark about 5-6 years ago. And you're seeing it light up. And what I call the spine of Africa that used to be black is now lighting up the landlocked countries, right? So it's good to see a lot of those investments coming into play. What I see is it's incumbent on us as an industry to make sure that we educate the regulators, government, so on. And in Africa, there's certain, we've got it's the body that you put together. Great stuff we've got from a data center point of view, Africa Data Centers Association. We've got Smart Africa as well as vehicles for achieving a lot of this education that we require. So yes, there's a lot going on. We need to continue to push forums like this to drive the agenda. So as an industry, we're clear on the same kind of messaging and consistent in the way we message to governments, regulators, and also in the way we educate those regulators. Regulation is not necessarily a bad thing. You have good regulators that are benign regulators, very positive for the industry, but then there's a cost. And also as an industry, we have to recognize that we have to, in a way, fund that for the good of the industry. But our advocacy has to be consistent, and we have to educate right across the continent. It's 54 countries after all.
Theo, your thoughts?
So I agree with everything Tunde has said so far. If we look over time, there's been a lot of change, and the change has been positive. And I think one thing we're seeing going forward, in addition to all of the investments, is there's also transformations and a growth in terms of demand. These digital transformations, both on the agriculture side, the fintech side, the health side, these are going to create more data. These are going to create more services that actually require more connectivity. And I suspect that over time, maybe not 10 years from now, maybe 20 years from now, AfPIF, there will actually be subgroups of maybe IXPs or the evolution of that actually coming together. I think you go back 10 years, there weren't that many IXPs now. Now we're seeing more of them. So I see this as a positive trajectory. It takes a lot of time. We compare ourselves with the US or Europe. They've had infinite amount of time. And I think we're getting a lot of the demand now. So it's going to take some time.
Thank you. Gaëtan, I know you're fixing the terrestrial problem. Can you also fix the subsea problem as an African?
Bon, il y a 54 pays africains, c'est vrai. 16 de ces pays sont enclavés, c'est-à-dire n'ont pas accès directement aux câbles sous-marins, n'ont accès finalement qu'à leurs pays voisins. Donc pour moi, l'une des clés également de la réussite de l'intégration en Afrique pour les infrastructures de l'économie numérique, c'est le succès des réseaux terrestres. Et donc c'est important de ne pas également négliger les réseaux terrestres qui sont indispensables à la connexion des pays qui sont plus profondément à l'intérieur du continent. Moi, je pense que des grands événements comme l'AfPIF ici, comme Africacom, comme l'ITW, qui sont des événements dans lesquels tous les techniciens se retrouvent et puis les decision makers se retrouvent, sont fondamentaux. Je pense aussi que des événements plus petits, qui rassemblent seulement, par exemple, 3 ou 4 pays voisins, voire des délégations qui vont régulièrement à la rencontre des voisins, peuvent être très efficaces pour échanger les stratégies, pour échanger les visions, pour échanger les projets. Moi, par exemple, j'ai travaillé avec Camtel en début d'année. Je travaille actuellement avec les différents opérateurs ici, qui soient en RDC, au Gabon ou ailleurs, de manière à essayer de faire, dans notre petit coin d'Afrique, une sorte d'intégration sous-régionale réussie et qui, j'espère, sera florissante dans quelques années.
Excellent. Thank you. Nomsa, to put you on the spot, will there come a point when Meta has cable building fatigue? And if that day comes, what does that mean for Africa? Are we done with getting cables? What's the plan for us? Because that's the reality, is that most of these cables are built by the content providers, either in whole or in part. So if the day comes when Meta and Google and AWS and Microsoft say we are tired of deploying cables because either we have enough or we don't have any more spare cash, then what?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, in the first place, Meta is not interested in building cables for the sake of building. It's coming from the need. And if you look at our global infrastructure, it needs that support. And I wouldn't be I don't wear that hat to answer that question, but it's all going to be from what drives the need. So if we need, we'll never really get to a point where we have that cable building fatigue. But then going back to your earlier question, we are not on the table most of the time. And I think we need to start driving some of these conversations. We are in a global environment after all. Cables coming from Africa are not there to just serve Africa. They are there to interconnect Africa to the rest of the world. So when the rest of the world is sitting and showcasing, we need to be on the table. We need to showcase there are amongst us people that do sea diving, for example, that can help with surveys. They're not known. I just recently met up with a team that's based in Nigeria. But we do have divers that come all the way from wherever they come from, which is great because after all, the job needs to be done. It needs to be done. But I think we need to do more to bring awareness, starting from just university level. I was in a conference last year and I asked a simple question: how many of you think the sea cable is smaller than your hand? Most people don't even know this. It's just basic information, basic knowledge, which just excites university level students, for example. They don't have any idea. The subsea community is largely closed, and even the subsea experts and in the industry that drives the subsea discussions, they have acknowledged that there is a huge gap. It's not just about Africa. It's about inclusion of different parts of the world, with different representation of the cables that exist in the world. But I think as Africa, the more we find the glue that gels us together, because as we see is interdependence on what happens on the sea that needs to also happen on the land, the more that we come together and then put that representation across on the same table as the rest of the world, then I think that may help to accelerate.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to the panel. Please put a warm round of applause for the panel. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.